Great. Can everybody hear me? Cool. Thanks for having me. And just to get started, how many people actually represent corporations? Can you just? Okay, cool. And I actually, before I get started, I wanted to start with a quick reflection because I have a soft spot for the private sector and what corporations are doing. And how many people, by show of hands, are familiar with the COP Annual Climate Summit? Okay, so it was in Brazil this year. So a couple of years ago, I went to the one that was in Glasgow, Scotland. And one of the keynote speakers was then Prince Charles, now King Charles. And the thing that he really focused on was the private sector as a lever. And he just talked about it's best poised because it has deeper budgets, it's more nimble, and it really got under my skin. And I really thought about, how much potential it has. And in 2025, where we have, at least in the United States, this inaction by the federal government, there's a real opportunity for you in the private sector to really showcase leadership. And so that honestly means a lot to me. And so the reason I'm excited to be here is to really learn from you guys to see what you're doing. So during the open discussions, please, I'd love to hear more about what you guys are doing. What I am and I'm doing is I'm part of a global climate change think tank. We're called World Resources Institute, or WRI. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., although I am locally based in Portland, Oregon. So if you need restaurant recommendations, come hit me up. We are active in about 50 countries, and most of the work that I do happens outside the United States. But when I talk to the conference organizers about what to present, one of the things that I thought might be really relevant to the people in the room would be some of the work we're doing around energy. So WRI as a whole focuses on anything that you could consider to be a sustainable development goal. But my portion of it deals with everything related to the global energy transition. And so the example that I'm going to be talking to you about today is really about aggregated procurement in renewable energy. And so it's basically how you take this power of the purchaser and leverage that for these huge impacts in greening your supply chain. And I'm going to be talking about a few different examples. The ones in the United States are in the public sector, but I thought it would be relevant because they're very much landmark deals and they relate to what's happening in this country. But also there are private sector examples in China and Vietnam that I'll talk about that are really good examples of how to deal with Scope 3 emissions and greening your supply chain. So to get started, I'll start with the United States, and we're talking about the public sector in this case in two different states, in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. And before I start getting into the case studies, I'll talk about how you go about purchasing clean and renewable energy. And so for people who aren't familiar, there are two main ways to go about it. You can build on-site renewable energy, and for that we're talking about, think about rooftop solar panels, things like that. But most people will go about buying off-site renewable energy. And there are two main ways that we'll talk about how you do that in this presentation. One is through a power purchase agreement, or a PPA, and that's when a contract is signed where you get physical transfer of energy. Electricity is generated someplace and it gets delivered physically to your facility. The other is a virtual power purchase agreement, or a VPPA, and that's when you sign a contract that's more remote and you're buying energy not directly but through the wholesale energy market. And to riff off something that Kevin mentioned earlier, there are siting concerns with that. You want to make sure that you're responsible to local communities that are affected, to the ecosystem. But, and we do actually have parts at WRI that definitely deal with that siting and permitting issue. But VPPAs can be a really effective way to purchase that. When you do that, you get credits through a renewable energy certificate or a REC, and you'll get credit for purchasing that renewable energy. And then lastly, at the bottom of the slide, I know it's hard to read at the back of the room, but we talk about aggregation. So when we talk about, in this context, what is aggregated procurement? You're just getting a group of buyers together that negotiate as a block, and they get favorable terms and pricings for renewable energy as that block of buyers. And then that goes into individual contracts for their own loads, for their own energy loads. So again, we're going to be talking about two different financial mechanisms. One is a power purchase agreement, or PPA. That's the physical delivery of electricity. And the second one is a VPPA, and that's typically more remote, and you're buying energy on the wholesale energy market. So it starts the process of this, and this is where WRI comes in, is we've helped people along with the process, everything from getting a cohort of purchasers together, to going through the RFP process, to ultimately getting an executed contract. And ultimately, this starts by getting a group of buyers together and ends when you get individual contracts signed. And there's a question of, okay, why would you even do this? So I'll fill this slide in. So there are a lot of benefits. I will save this slide for later. I won't go unpack everything because I think we're short on time. But the reasons that you would do this is you can make a bigger impact, first and foremost. So if you're working with a local government, or in your case, a corporation, if you have corporations that have ambitious climate goals or energy reduction goals, you can actually make a bigger impact by pooling resources with a number of other buyers. You have access to more and larger scale projects. The greater economies of scale, what does that mean? It means you lock into favorable pricing, often pricing that's better than if you just procured from the grid itself. And then you can reduce market risks. And so what does that mean? So for many people, energy is a very volatile cost, and it's unpredictable. So you can hedge your bet and lock into a contract with a long-term fixed price, and you're basically hedging your risk down the road. You can pool expenses. So you can, in many cases, share expenses that would be prohibitive if you were to go alone, especially if you're a small or medium-sized buyer. And the last thing is you can build into a peer network. So you can, in many cases, there are people with more or less experience with purchasing. And in many cases, you can have a mentor-mentee relationship, but ultimately you're building the capacity of a whole block of purchasers to be able to do this on their own later. So I'm going to go into the case studies. So we'll start with what happened in Pennsylvania. And I know this, this font is probably small for people in the back of the room, but basically in Pennsylvania, we had a power purchase agreement in the public sector, and this was 10 different purchasers. On the right side of the screen, there's a map of Centre County, Pennsylvania. There are a number of townships. There's a school board. There are a couple of water districts. And they basically procured solar energy to the tune of 20 megawatts, and that's going to be a new facility that will be purchased, that will be built in Centre County, Pennsylvania. And that means about 77% of their total energy is being acquired through this solar. And they were able to lock in favorable rates, favorable pricing, and a long-term contract. By contrast, in Massachusetts, we had a much larger public sector procurement vehicle. So they had signed a VPPA, again, a virtual power purchase agreement, for 408 megawatts. So that was done because the energy that was being generated wasn't coming from Massachusetts. It's going to be coming from two different solar farms, in North Dakota and in Texas. And the nature of this marks kind of a landmark achievement for VPPAs in the United States because of the different types of people that were involved. You had, for people that know Boston, you had heavy duty, you had the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, you had the Brigham health system, which is one of the largest in the state, you had MIT, you had Harvard University. For those who are PBS fans, you had WGBH, which is the big production powerhouse in Boston. And the nature of how diverse these stakeholders were made this kind of a landmark achievement. And then it ended up being contracted for two 15-year VPPAs. And what you're looking at on the right side of the screen is one of the two solar farms, each one about 200 megawatts each. This one's the Big Elm solar farm in Texas. And then the impact of this, from the slide that we saw earlier, is huge. It's 1.3 million megawatts of clean energy are being produced every year, and that it avoids the release of more than 950 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, about the equivalent of the annual energy consumption of 130,000 homes. So you can get very large impacts by doing this. But this is the public sector, and we probably care about the private sector. So we'll move on to China. And so another show of hands, has anybody ever heard of a company called Decathlon? Okay, there's a reason for that. which is that it's not very popular in the United States, but it's a huge retail sporting goods company in the rest of the world. If you think of Dick's Sporting Goods, it's similar to that. And it has a manufacturing footprint in China. And so China had renewable energy and climate goals that it wanted to hit. And so it used its influence to try to clean up its supply chain. And so it brought together 14 suppliers in Fujian province in 2023, and they signed a PPA, in this case, to purchase energy from offshore solar. On the right side of the screen, you can see a photo of that offshore solar farm. It's involved in an estimated $190 million investment, and the 200 megawatt offshore solar farm will generate about 260 gigawatts of renewable energy every year. And this was a really good example of how a corporation can look up and down its value chain and figure out how to leverage its influence to help them do the right thing, but also a competitive thing. Because if you're working for a company that has climate goals and you are fueled by renewable energy, you can outcompete somebody who doesn't. And this model in China was so successful that other global brands who have a footprint in China followed suit after 2023. So in the last 2 years, we had Pepsi, we had Lenovo, we had Apple, who all embraced this decathlon model and helped work with its own suppliers to create contract PPAs. And so at the bottom of the slide, it's small font again, but it means all of these partners pooled together represent 1.6 terawatts of renewable energy contracts in about a dozen provinces in China. So this is, a really good example of how corporations can look through its supply chain and work through a financial mechanism like this to actually help clean up what's happening in their value chain. And the last example I'll talk about is in Vietnam. And again, this is private sector. This is private sector in the apparel industry, and we'll talk for a moment on why the apparel industry is important in Vietnam. And we used an initiative that we call the Clean Energy Investment Accelerator. So CEIA, WRI was one of 3 partners that created this, and it really was trying to tap into large corporations and large energy buyers to try to get them to procure clean and renewable energy. In this case, we're not talking about off-site solar, we're talking about on-site solar, so a little bit different, but it's on-site solar for suppliers. And just to step back, why is the apparel industry important in Vietnam? So it represents about 2% of global emissions. In Vietnam, it represents a big chunk of GDP, about 16%. It's the 4th largest supplier of apparel, Vietnam, to the world. And in the right side of the screen, this breaks up how emissions are represented through Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And as you can see, the vast majority of emissions in the apparel sector come from Scope 3, the supply chain, 96%. So by targeting this, you're actually making a big dent in an industry that does represent a lot of emissions. So what CEIA did was create a suite of on-site solar, rooftop solar projects in Vietnam, in the apparel industry. And on the left side of this table, under the WHO, you'll see a couple of familiar brands. You'll see Arc'teryx, you'll see Lululemon. But what we care about is the line in yellow, which is the aggregated procurement deal that represented the PPA that we had in place in Vietnam. And that was 6 global brands and 9 suppliers, and it represented energy to the tune of 22 megawatts. And in this next slide, on the bottom of the slide, you can see the brands represented. We have Gap, Arc'teryx, Lululemon, Columbia Sportswear, Target, again, using their influence to try to create PPAs to help their suppliers procure clean and renewable energy in the form of rooftop solar. And what ended up happening is that the suppliers did lock in better pricing than the grid. They did learn from each other on again, this is the peer network part of it. They learned from each other on how you go about doing a PPA, how you go about procuring renewable energy. They pooled resources so that they split their costs across the cohort. And then they became more competitive because you had suppliers who were now being powered by rooftop solar So they are able to help brands that have climate goals fulfill their goals. And then this last slide is just kind of a list of things that we did to help prepare them. Basically, what our WRI did as a think tank is we prepare tools and resources and provide technical assistance to help define what a roadmap would look like, and in many cases fill the gap of technical capacity. So that could be everything from guidelines, toolbooks, research that we will provide, how to put together an RFP, how the selection process works, how the contracting process works. And these tools end up becoming free and public tools. So the hope is that if somebody wants to do this on their own, these are resources that you can use to then apply those lessons to your work. So I'll end by just saying there are resources available. If you're curious about this, I can point you to the right direction. It's meant to be free. It's meant to really kind of help build your own capacity. So I'm hoping that helps. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, and thanks for having me.